Both legitimate technicians as well as attackers have many techniques that they can use to discover wireless networks, essentially map them out, where they are, how they're configured. One way to do this is an old technique called war chalking, as in writing with chalk on the sidewalk. This is a way that you can walk around a metropolis area with your scanning device, which could be a smartphone with an app, picking out wireless networks that are open, and then marking on the sidewalk, literally, that there's an open network here. Now, naturally, that only goes so far as being useful, but it is an actual technique that actually occurs. And that's called war chalking. We also have war driving. You can imagine yourself maybe in an industrial park in your car with your laptop and your Pringles can antenna scanning for wireless networks as you're driving around. And your computer has a scanning app, maybe like NetSpot, where you save all of that information and analyze it later, looking at the networks that were discovered as you were driving around. So that's war driving. These days, with drones that are so cheaply available, we can also enable Wi-Fi on a drone. Think about that for a second. That's called war flying. So you can control your drone and maybe fly it over to your neighbor's house, above their house, and scan what Wi-Fi networks might be available over there. I'm not saying that you should do that or that it's ethical. It's not illegal to do that. It would be illegal to intentionally break into an encrypted Wi-Fi network. That's illegal. But it's not illegal just to scan and see what's out there. So that's an interesting way that could be used by, again, both legitimate technicians or attackers. Now, on the wireless access point, or AP side, now, we have to be careful because sometimes people will interchange the terms wireless access point and wireless router. Technically, a wireless router not only allows a wireless network to exist, to allow wireless clients to connect to it, but a wireless router allows those connections to go to another network like the internet. So technically, that's the difference between just an access point and a router. But either way, I'm going to use the term access point here. So what we're talking about is a rogue access point. What does this mean? It means that there's an access point, a Wi-Fi access point that perhaps is plugged into our network that shouldn't be. And maybe it's a result of a user bringing it from home and plugging it in for convenience because you don't have Wi-Fi in your environment. The other way that this might happen is in the form of an evil twin. What does that term mean? It means that an attacker has intentionally created a Wi-Fi access point. Now, that could be that they perhaps came into the reception area in an office building and maybe plugged in a wireless router because there's an open network port that hasn't been disabled behind a plant. And that gives them wireless access after they walk out of that building. Or it could be as simple as someone in a coffee shop on their smartphone turning on a Wi-Fi hotspot. Just imagine if you're at Starbucks having a delicious coffee and someone near you that's malicious turns on a Wi-Fi hotspot on their smartphone and they call it Starbucks free Wi-Fi. How confusing is that? Because if that's what the real wireless network name is called, how many people, how many patrons in that store are going to connect to the malicious user access point? That's an evil twin. It mimics a real access point with the same name, but it's not the real thing. Now, you might say, what's the harm in that? What's the harm? We know that there's a problem when attackers can see all network traffic that they otherwise really shouldn't. That's just one less thing they have to figure out. So that's what an evil twin is. Now let's get into some techie stuff related to Wi-Fi. Specifically, I want to talk about beacon frames. What happens is approximately every 100 milliseconds, we have a beacon frame that gets sent out. Now that's from the access point. Now what this means is that we're sending out information that allows people on their smartphones, for instance, to say, oh, look, I got a Wi-Fi network that just popped up. That's because of the beacon frames that are constantly being sent out by the access point. The thing is that clients have no way to verify that a beacon frame they receive is legitimate. One reason is because that occurs before they authenticate to the network in the first place, doesn't it? So how can you verify that? How can you have a digital signature, or how can you encrypt it? You're just seeing it in the first place to initiate a connection. So they can be maliciously formed. Now, the beacon frame will contain things like the name of the wireless network, unless it's been disabled from being broadcast. It'll contain information like the maximum transmit power, so how far the signal is allowed to emanate, other details related to the configuration of the access point. So that's what's in a beacon frame. So Wi-Fi attacks come in many forms, one of which is simply connecting to a discovered wireless network that's open. Now, if you are using a scanning tool like we were looking at earlier, NetSpot, and it shows you an access point that is open, that means there's no authentication. And sometimes that's okay, like in a public Wi-Fi zone in a municipality, in a city. Maybe you don't have to sign in and maybe there's no encryption. Now, another common Wi-Fi attack is for access points that are configured with WEP for encryption, wired equivalent privacy. Mike talked about that earlier. Essentially, we can crack a WEP passphrase in seconds with freely available tools. So is it better than nothing? Yeah, it's better than nothing. The casual user won't know how to do that, but it's not going to keep the real attackers out. Then think about things like radio frequency signal jamming. You might have even seen that in old wartime movies. We're going to send out a lot of these random radio signals to jam legitimate transmissions. You can do the exact same thing with Wi-Fi if you have the right equipment, because it's just sending radio waves through the air. So really that turns out to be interference or jamming. We already know that if we have Wi-Fi channels in close proximity to one another for different networks that are the same, that can cause intermittent connectivity issues. We can also flood an access point with what's called deauthentication packets. Deauthentication, well, I know what authentication is because we've talked about that. Authenticating is proving identity. So in the case of Wi-Fi, if you authenticate to the Wi-Fi network, you've proven your identity, maybe by knowing the passphrase, and you're in. So what does deauthentication mean? Oh, this is a technique used by attackers is what it is. In order for me to try to capture network traffic on a Wi-Fi network and break into it, I need to be able to capture the initial authentication. So for a client already connected to a Wi-Fi network, what do? I kick them off. And that's called deauthentication. Sometimes you'll see it called disassociation, but that's the same thing. We'll get into that a little bit later when we actually take a look at how to crack WPA2 wireless networks. So you can consider that to be one way of cracking a network, to break into a Wi-Fi network, but also it can also be denial of service because you keep kicking someone off the network. In other words, denying them from getting on the wireless network in the first place. So let's take a look in Linux at how we might start to work with a wireless interface to start doing some of the things that we've talked about, like scanning for access points in close proximity. So what I've got here is a Kali Linux virtual machine, and I've got a USB network card, a Wi-Fi card plugged in. Now to do some of the things I'm going to show you, the built-in Wi-Fi card in your computer, whether it's a smartphone or a laptop, might not work. Here's why. Because you need to have a network card and a driver for it that supports promiscuous mode. Promiscuous mode means that instead of only being concerned with its own network traffic, it's listening to everything. The second thing is you might need, depending on the tools you're using, your Wi-Fi network card and driver to support something called packet injection. So don't be surprised if you try to use your built-in Wi-Fi card and some of these things don't work for you. So at any rate, what I'm going to do here in Linux is I'm going to start with ifconfig. We know about this command. It shows network interfaces and IP configurations for those interfaces, but what's new that we haven't seen yet is that it's showing us that we have a wireless network interface. It's called, in this case, WLAN, wireless LAN 0. Now, depending on the Linux distribution, it might be called something else. That's why we need to do ifconfig, or actually, you know what you could do? You could run iwconfig. That's like ifconfig, but it only shows wireless interfaces. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth cards, that kind of thing. Once again, it's showing me my interface WLAN 0. Okay, that's perfect. So the next thing that we might do if we want to scan the vicinity for wireless networks, just using free command line tools, is I'll start here with sudo, because this is a privileged command and I'm not logged into Linux's root. sudo aerodump. Now I'm spelling that AIRODUMP-NG. So aerodump next generation. Then I have to tell it the wireless interface I want to essentially scan on. In this case, it's just WLAN 0, isn't it? We've proven that with ifconfig and iwconfig. Now, this is the first time I've run sudo in this Linux session, so it says, hey, what's your current user password? Okay, I'll go ahead and enter that. Now, don't be stressed out if you get a message like I did. It says the device or resource is busy. Just give it a second, and you'll see as what happened here, it immediately snaps out of it. So what it's doing here is in the leftmost column, it's showing me a whole bunch of BSS IDs. What's that? Those are the MAC addresses for all of the wireless access points within range. You can imagine if you have a Cantenna, you'll get a lot more listed because you have a much larger range. I can also see things like the channel under the CH column. These are two important items, as you'll see later on when we start breaking into wireless networks, because you need to know the MAC address of the access point, and you need to know what channel it's configured on. Now, there's more information over to the right, such as whether it's using WPA2 encryption, WPA3, OPN. Guess what that means? Open. That's a wireless network that has perhaps no security at all. So we can see some of these things. If I even look further, for example, next to WPA2, under auth, it shows PSK, pre-shared key. In other words, a symmetric key. If I know the key, I can type it in, I'm on the network. That's telling me it is not using radius authentication, because that's called enterprise authentication. Pre-shared keys is just, if you know the key, you're in. So the point then is that we have to understand how to scan for wireless networks, both for fixing performance problems, troubleshooting intermittent connectivity, and unfortunately, malicious users will use the same tools to break into wireless networks illegally. And we're going to see how to do that a little bit later, not because we want to do anything illegal, because we want to know how to prevent it from happening.